Hello and welcome to the special pre-budget roundtable discussion of the Board of India Today economists. On February 28th, Union Finance Minister P.Chidambaram will present the last budget of UPA-II in the run-up to the general elections scheduled for April and May 2014. The economic scenario is challenging. Growth is at a 10-year low. Inflation by some measures is still in double digits. The current account deficit and fiscal deficit are at dangerously high levels. The economy needs a quick fix. But Mr. Chidambaram has other challenges. This being a pre-election budget, he may need to inject a dose of populism as well. To discuss the challenges before Mr. Chidambaram and what he might do, I am joined by Sandeep Bamzai, editor Mail Today, who's the co-moderator for this session. We have an eminent panel of economists, industrialists and politicians to discuss the issues. Mr. Arun Shourie, former Union Minister of Disinvestment and Telecom, author and columnist. Mr. R.C. Bhargav, Chairman of India's largest car maker, Maruti Suzuki. Vivek Debroy, economist and professor at the Center for Policy Research. Gurcharan Das, former CEO of Procter & Gamble India, now author and columnist. Ashima Goyal, professor of economics at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research. And Ajit Ranade, President and Chief Economist at the Aditya Birla Group. Sandeep.
As once again Dheeraj said, we have a panel of eminence. I'll pose the first question to Mr. Shourie. Are there genuine green shoots emerging? What is the state of the economy? Because the macroeconomic indicators are extremely negative.
Yes, I think they are, but this dispute between 5 and 5.5% is a meaningless dispute, because as Vivek will tell us, about 55% of the GDP is estimated by rules of thumb and not by actual estimation. But the summary point was made by in a report which I read, which is very well done, that the economy used to be 4 and 5 to 9 and 10, 4 and 5% inflation to 9 and 10% growth. It has been reversed, 9 and 10% inflation and 4 and 5% growth, and this is the main thing to worry about, and for which to judge the budget really is the bludgeoning of investor confidence in India. Public sector investment in any case had gone down because of deficits and other things, and because of inability to take decisions. But private investment, which was almost 15% of GDP, having fallen to 9% of GDP within a span of 2-3 years. This is the alarming thing, and this is the test. It didn't happen because of the budgets, but budgets contributed to it. It happened because investor confidence was bludgeoned.
Let me bring in Mr. Bhargav here, because Mr. Bhargav is part of the real economy. Automobile, there's an old saying in economics which says that the economy moves on wheels. So the growth or the sluggishness in the automobile sector gives us some, it gives us a prism, a window to see how the economy is faring. Do you believe that all that Mr. Chidambaram has done after the last reshuffle is optics, or do you think there's more to what he has done in terms of decision making?
See, Sandeep, what's happened to the economy in my mind is that the earlier growth was largely driven by the services sector, and industry and agriculture were more or less carrying around at the old rates of growth. Now the services sector has plateaued out, that IT and BPO and all are not growing the way they used to grow. The manufacturing sector, which was never very good, has become much worse. But we must keep in mind that the budget does not do very much for the manufacturing sector. The bulk of the action in the manufacturing sector is in the states. And the states somehow seem to get left out of all debate on what they are supposed to do or not do to promote manufacturing. And most states are actually quite negative.
But that is also a function of the high interest rate regime which has existed in this country for the last about almost 2 years now. Manufacturing has been squeezed, the investment cycle has been squeezed. 5 million jobs have been lost in India between 2004 and 2010. That's a serious number. So we're talking about jobless growth at the end of the day.
I agree with that, but only partly. And when one is talking about job losses, it's something like this, that if the economy grows at 5%, we create about 7.5 million new jobs a year. If the economy grows at 10%, we create about 15 million new jobs a year. So it's also in terms of the new jobs that are not being created. I only partly agree with the interest rate issue. I do think that interest rates need to be softened, but I would say that there are three sets of issues which are messing things up. One is there is a clear correlation between fiscal profligacy and decline in rate of growth. And if you go back to the high growth years of 2003 to let's say 2007, those were years of fiscal consolidation without looking at what was happening in the rest of the world. That's point number one. Point number two, we have had very serious problems with forest clearances, environmental clearances, land acquisition. Point number three, particularly under UPA-II, in addition to what I have said about forest, environment and land, there has been a complete collapse of decision making, and this is an executive failure. It's not, contrary to popular perception, the legislative conundrum that results from a coalition government.
Right, Vivek. Mr. Das, if I could ask you, there is one view that decision making had stalled down, there was policy paralysis. But after Mr. Chidambaram came to office in August, do you think there's been a turnaround in investor sentiment?
Well, to some extent, because money has come in, and I think Chidambaram is focusing on the right number to help the economy, and that's the fiscal deficit number. He keeps coming back to that number, and really that's where the test of all of us at the budget time will be the credibility of that number, whether those cuts will actually be made, or are this just rhetoric? And so because the fiscal, if we can contain the fiscal deficit even to the numbers that he's been talking about, what it means is that you have a chance of moderation of inflation, you have the chance of a pickup in investor sentiment, and you have the chance of picking up the growth rate. I just wanted to add to what Arun and Vivek have said with regard to the relationship of jobs. That, you know, when we see these GDP numbers, for the ordinary person, it just looks like numbers, something academic on a piece of paper. But the amazing the amount of pain and misery that have been brought about to the Indian people is not appreciated. And Vivek once said to me that 1% rise in GDP means 1.5 million new jobs. Now each job, what he should have added is that each job creates 3 indirect jobs. And so you multiply, and then each job supports 5 people in a family. So if you do your arithmetic, this government, which has had a great talent in bringing down the growth rate from 5% to 9% to 5%, just think of the human pain and misery that they have brought about in this country.
But Ajit, just to do a quick wrap of all that we've discussed till now, all that Mr. Chidambaram is doing seems to be a function of rating agencies. Because he wants to avoid a downgrade, he is bolstering investor sentiment or talking up the markets is a big accusation against him forever. Is that a fact?
It's rating agencies, but more importantly, the foreign investors and institutional investors. What's happened is, because the current account deficit now has become a real concern, so long as it was below 3% or 3.5% of GDP, it was automatically taken care of by various other capital flows, including stock market flows, but certainly there was FDI and there was other flows. What has happened is that a big part of FDI has now gone down. So therefore, we are increasingly dependent on what are called the FII flows, institutional flows, which tend to be fickle and which tend to respond to sentiments much more than FDI. FDI is, of course, a long-term, investment which comes here for the long term. They are not affected by seasonality or fickleness. So I think the big concern is that we need to be, we need to give out a signal, at least to the FII flows, and of course relatedly to the rating agencies. But just one small point is to put a counterpoint actually. When India was growing at 9%, we became a $1 trillion economy. That was roughly in 2006. And there was much celebration that we had joined the $1 trillion club, only about a dozen countries worldwide. Today actually we are close to $2 trillion in dollar terms. So when an economy grows at 9% at 1 trillion, a twice the size economy growing at 5.5% is still adding the same amount of GDP. That's not to take away the points regarding job creation and the pain and misery of inflation, but let's keep it in context that we are growing at about 5.5% in a world which is struggling to grow at 2 or 1%.
But that, Ajit, seems to be the line, and Ashima, if you could pick it up from there, that seems to be the line of the government, which is that look at the havoc that is being wreaked all around the world. We are a safe haven. We're doing 5%. We're doing 6%. Look at the US. Look at the Eurozone. Look at Japan. But I don't think we should be happy with what 5% or 6% is doing for us, because the pain and misery, as Mr. Das pointed out, is serious. There is the human element, and its suffering is probably the most significant thing here.
Yes, absolutely, I agree. This was India's opportunity to really go ahead, catch up, sort of transition to a more developed country, and things were going smoothly. Most countries that have reached this threshold then grow much faster. So our catch up seems to be much more volatile, and that is, we can't blame it on external events. It is problems we have internally also. I think governance and agricultural productivity, and then the current account deficit, and tied to that the fall in financial savings, because that reflects directly in the current account deficit. We have had a lot of financial reforms, but somehow our household savings are not intermediated through the financial sector, and partly because of high inflation, they're going into gold. We haven't provided adequate inflation hedges. So that reflects in a widening. It's come down by about 4 percentage points from 12% to 8% of GDP. That immediately reflects in a widening of the current account deficit.
Mr. Shori, if I could ask you the politics of this, do you think at some level UPA misread the electoral verdict of 2009, that they didn't attribute it enough to high growth and that they attributed it to spending?
Yes, that is their traditional mode. Thus, that whenever you do throw money out, spending, see, supposing you were spending to create capital assets, that would be something. But if you just throw it out of the window and say this is, and many people are there to applaud it, that this is going to mean removal of miserization in the rural areas, and that will create rural demand, and FMCGs will grow much faster and so on. Today, on the figures that I get in Bombay, that there are 900 projects costing with an outlay which could be of 4,80,000 crores, which are pending because of clearances of this environment and forest, to such an extent that the National Highways Authority has had to go and file a writ against the Ministry of Environment and Forests to make clearances karo. To clear projects in the infrastructure, you make the dues, clear the dues. Dues certainly will be giving a stimulus to a wide range of industries, including manufacturing industries and design and service industries in India. That's within our capacity. We don't do it.
Mr. Bhargav, have clearances speeded up at all?
Clearances have always been a problem. It's all become slower now, but I think nowhere in India at any time did we get clearances as quickly as we should get. It is approvals, it's the inspector route, it's the various obstacles which come from the tax people coming and blocking something, or some obscure old law which has no relevance, but we decided, oh, you're violating that law and therefore you can't do this. It all carries on. Nobody is interested in putting it right. I believe that the highest priority now has to be to grow manufacturing. Job creation in the future has to come from the manufacturing industry. It will not come from the services sector. It will not come for the people coming from villages in the services sector. It has to be manufacturing. We have, I don't know how many priorities in decision making in India. Mr. Shori will know better, but maybe any decision comes, there are 10 ministries with different priorities, and therefore no decision gets taken.
Yes, Mr. Das.
Well, you know, I just want to emphasize what he and Arun were just saying, that a new study has come out by a person named Ghani and with other contributors for the World Bank, and they have looked at the impact of the Golden Quadrilateral that was created. Mostly, it started in 2001 and was mostly ended by 2007. It was completed. They have shown what a dramatic number of jobs, factories, and productivity, labor productivity rose within 10 kilometers of the Golden Quadrilateral. Now this is a dramatic example of the right kind of spending that you do instead of the make work jobs and other kind of spending.
But this again was something that we saw during Atalji's time and the NDA dispensation. Decision making was faster. In fact, the momentum of that decision making came in the first 4 years of UPA-I, where we saw extremely high growth rates. Do you believe, Vivek, that the 9 years are an opportunity lost?
No one per se is objecting to clearances. The problem is, if I've got forest clearances, if I've got environmental clearances, why can't they be done parallelly? Why do they have to be done sequentially? Once I have got a clearance, why does it have to be opened up with retrospective effect? And the last one is something that's often not flagged. Many of these clearances ought to be under 7 scheduled state subjects. And there has been a centralization of this. Consequently, the delays are increasing even more. To come back to your point, UPA-I and UPA-II, I disagree with the policies of both. I think that when posterity judges this period, posterity will judge this period as a period that was exactly like the mid-end 60s and the mid-70s. Having said that, at least under UPA-I, things got done. I may disagree with what was done, but at least you had the MGNREGS, you had the RTI. Under UPA-II, there has been a complete collapse. And one additional point I'd like to make is when there is a bureaucrat often takes a bona fide decision. I'm not talking about malafide decisions. It's up to the ministerial class to insulate that bureaucrat from the consequences of that bona fide decision. In the last 5 years, the CBI, out of 600 joint secretary and above officers we have of IAS rank, the CBI has launched inquiries against 122. Even if I assume that 95% of these are malafide, the bona fide ones are also getting affected, and so no one is taking a decision. Ministers are not taking a decision. The cabinet does not function. That's the problem.
Which is not under question, because time and time again, bureaucrats themselves have told us that we cannot take a decision, because if we take a decision, if we sign on a file, 5 years later we could be going to jail.
Sandeep, but there's another point. It's not just it is very important that there is non-decisions, but it is the return to arbitrariness and the return to the control and inspector Raj, which was the one that was going down.
True.
After all, if supposing Mr. Bhargava were also on the board of POSCO or of Vedanta, and you spend 20,000 crore on a project, and suddenly somebody says, I am kisi ka sipahi, or wo band kar deta hai. So it is arbitrariness, and the retrospective taxation is one element of that. But
there's one other element, Mr. Shourie, which is the legal overhang or the legal scrutiny. That itself is hampering decision making, because what we've seen in the 2G case with the cancellation of the licenses is that an investor wants surety, because he has other fish to fry.
Sandeep, that is when there is no government, everybody becomes a government. Anna Hazare becomes a government, Swami Ramdev becomes a government, Supreme Court becomes a government, Jai Ram Ramesh becomes the government of India. So that's the problem. There is no government.
Ashima, the point has been made by both Mr. Shourie and Mr. Debroy that private investment has fallen by 4 percentage points of GDP. How long does it take for it to recover? I mean, does Mr. Chidambaram or this government have enough time left to make it recover back to the levels it was?
I think that India has enough intrinsic demands. We have young people setting up house, and compared to the rest of the world, which is aging and so on. So there are profit opportunities here, and after a period of slack, as capacity begins to bite, low investment, you should see an upturn. But I think the governance issues are really crucial. I would just like to make a couple of points on that debate which is going on here. That I think it's not correct to say that the problem is people don't take decisions. I think it's more systemic than that. One, the sheer scale of the problem. You know, if it's $1 trillion of infrastructure investment, the size of investment that has to be made, this number of clearances that have to be given, we have not scaled up our governance structures suitably. And second is the multiple authorities, lack of accountability, too many committees, people have to get together and decide. So here there were the expenditure reform commissions, because the structure of government was already for an earlier era of controls and so on, but now when it's largely private investment driven, then you need a different structure that has to be put in. So to just support the argument here, just let me, one more thing, which is I looked at the sequence, you say corruption and it broke with the Commonwealth Games, which were in 2010. But if you talk to banks and so on, they had started getting worried in 2009, before that, because the loans for infrastructure they were seeing that the projects are not moving because of lack of clearances.
But
so there's
a reason for that. If you now go back, suppose I do a rewind. Let's go back to 2004 when Mr. Chidambaram became the finance minister. The first thing that he did, he gave interviews saying that I am not the finance minister of India. I am the minister for investment, as you may remember. And immediately after that, there were road shows which were done in the United States, in London, in Europe, where the same figure of, at that particular point in time, it was 750 billion, that we need X amount of money, 500 billion of infrastructure. We are operating at a standstill.
Yes.
9 years have passed by and there is no movement forward.
So at the heart of this new investment shows. He's going around the same
absolutely
again.
all over again.
Other countries have faced, they all have environmental clearances. I have a friend who works for the American EPA. They have a problem of clearances, but they have a system. And within 30 days, within 60 days, within 90 days, actions are taken. Here, this has been really the most amazing, and the other day Mr. Tata said that, look, somebody said, why are you investing abroad? He says, I've been waiting 8 years for the approval of the investment to our steel expansion. So I think this is really a question of a crisis, as she said, of the state. We have a crisis of governance, and what we need are the reforms of the institutions, be able to insulate bureaucrats.
In the first section of this special discussion of the Board of India Today Economists, we discussed the state of the economy. There seems to be deep pessimism about the state of the economy, and a lot of the worries are about non-budgetary items, especially clearances. But in this section, let's talk about the budget. What exactly can Mr. Chidambaram do in the budget to fix the economy? We had in the first section a discussion on the fiscal deficit number and the magic number of 4.8% of GDP that Mr. Chidambaram is looking at. Mr. Shourie, does he have to raise taxes to do this? He's already talking about raising taxes on the rich. Is that a viable option? Should he do it?
So that will only, this business of taxing the super rich is, as my friend Arvind Dattar, the constitution lawyer, has said, a super foolish idea. Because it will only lead to one of the good things that, the reversal of one of the good things that has been happening, and which is better tax compliance. People will just vote with their feet and with their money and then again start hiding it. I would think the much better way is not taxes but focus on expenditure. And on that, on two things. One, the government has made very good beginning on cutting subsidies, for instance, in petroleum products and in railway rates. In the last 2 years, electricity rates have been raised by 30% across states. Coal prices have been raised by 15 to 20%. And all this business can be dharna hoga, that is just a photo opportunity.
The end user is willing to pay.
Yes. So have confidence in that and proceed on the expenditure side, not on this business of...
And learn from other countries. France did this stupidity a few months ago,
everybody is
and they raised the tax on those people earning over €1 million to 75%. There was a recent poll which said that many of the, a good chunk of the French super rich are now considering moving to Belgium, UK, and they're just abandoning the country.
I think there's also
Mr. Bhargav, manufacturing. Now, Maruti Suzuki is one of the bulwarks of manufacturing, has been for many, many years. What would you like to see in the budget?
Certainly we would like interest rates to come down for these people.
But that
requires deficits have to be cut, subsidies have to be cut, and that's the decision which Mr. Chidambaram can't take on his own. The government as a whole has to have the political will to cut these deficits. We blame Mr. Chidambaram from something. It's not only Mr. Chidambaram. I think the blame is a little bit more spread out than just the finance minister.
If I can just, can he be credible on the fiscal deficit number without actually raising some amount of taxes or without making a substantial cut in subsidies?
Actually, in fact, as we were discussing earlier, it is possible to stick to the number that has been announced, and in fact, reduce it a little bit. On interest rate, I just want to point out the biggest elephant in the room, by the way, is interest payments. The one single item which the government of India's budget has, the largest item of almost 5 lakh crores, which is 1/3 of the budget, is interest rates, interest payment. So even if you reduce interest rates by 0.25%, the savings is almost 17,000 crores. Now, of course, it's not the government which decides interest rates, but the government gives a signal and which helps the Reserve Bank reduce interest rates. So this is certainly that is completely doable, and it should be a very high priority. How do you send anti-inflationary, because interest rates ultimately are basically determined by the outlook for inflation. How do you send an anti-inflationary message to the budget? By doing something about subsidies, rationalization, by doing something about the quality of deficit as well. When you have more productive spending, that of course, and this is one country, I think, unlike Europe, where austerity is actually a good thing, meaning austerity is getting a bad name in Europe, and even the IMF is now backing up, is sort of on a back foot. But in India, actually, this austerity is likely to lead to a lot of virtuous cycle. You have lower interest rates, therefore lower deficit, because lower interest rate payment, and therefore possibly lower inflation.
But Vivek, how do you, in an election year, how do you balance this business of spending and profligacy that we've seen in spending with austerity? It's at one level it's an oxymoron, because over the last 9 years we've seen, and particularly on the cusp of an election, we saw both MNREGA and the farm loan waiver. So are we going to see something similar? We are already hearing talk of a full-blown food security bill, which will only add to our woes.
No, look, it's an oxymoron, but it's also some statistical jugglery. And with statistical jugglery, you can certainly get 4.8% for the year that's coming. I'm not very sure how he's going to manage the 5.3 in the revised estimates. I don't think, by the way, he will actually hike rates. He will do it through a subterfuge like surcharges. Yeah. But what he will do, because Mr. Chidambaram is identified with that kind of action, is to go hammer and tongs against, within quotes, people who should be paying taxes but are not paying taxes.
So a lot of action. What you're also saying at one level is he'll give the middle class something, which is, there is talk that the exemption limit will be raised, and on the other side he'll be taking stuff away from them.
Yes, that is one very important point that Vivek was making. Watch his accounting. Not only the items that Vivek was saying. In the earlier budgets, for instance, in one budget he had 200,000 crores of expenditure, which he showed as something called off-budget items. They were going to have inflationary consequences, but he said they're off-budget. They were not included. But I would return to the things that can be done. See, budget is not just about taxes and expenditures. It is actually the statement of policy of the government. Reassurance to investors. You asked the question of Mr. Bhargav about manufacturing. One point is this point about infrastructure and how that will stimulate things if you give faster clearances, clear due. Second is, I'll give you, every defense minister since Mr. George Fernandez has said, we will involve private sector in defense production. The fact is, it is a monopoly of DRDO. We are falling behind. In the private sector, automobiles, everywhere, you have built engineering and technical capacity for weapons production. We don't allow it to go forward. Today, this Westland business has started. We are making for the Americans the body of the helicopter in Hyderabad, but the company cannot make it for India. So, you just open up the defense sector for production, forget these big technocrats to collaborate in this. You will certainly give a boost to the engineering industries in 3 months.
Will there be any big ticket and reform announcements?
Well, I doubt it. But one thing he can do, and I would just follow what Arun has just said, that one of the things that makes investors shy of India is his own department, is the revenue collection process, which is not transparent, which is not fair, and which is not equitable. Now, instead of, the fear that people have is that and this is Chidambaram's habit, to go after people who are already paying tax. And so you're victimizing the very people who are honest. And
Mr.
so therefore,
Bhargav wanted to comment on
yeah.
that.
You know, we've talked of governance. I think one of the biggest lacuna in the whole area is our capacity to implement anything. And we never talk of why implementation in India, whether it's on the income tax side or whether it's on the implementation of infrastructure projects or why on any other education, why implementation is so poor. And I think that's an area which requires a lot of attention. We have created today a climate of suspicion all around. And the decision making which does not take place, or why people will not award a contract in time, they will form a committee while they'll pass on the file to somebody else, is because of this fear and suspicion which has happened, where we do not trust anybody to do anything.
I think there's a risk that they'll go ahead with populist spending in, say, food and subsidies and cut down on areas such as roads, where Mr. Das earlier said the Golden Quadrilateral, for example, in NDA's time was very good spending. Do you think they may cut down some of the spending which is needed to actually fund spending which is not needed? Is there a risk of that?
Yeah, I think that they are going to cut down on subsidies on petroleum and so on, because that's becoming just too large. So probably they will cut there, raise fuel prices, and then the food security. But I believe markets have factored that in, they are okay with it. But the broad issue here is that there are two things this budget has to do. We've talked about those signals to investors, and you need investment to finance the current account deficit. But that just caps the downside to the market. But for markets to really boom, you need growth. So the budget has to do something for that. So what can they do? And here I think broadening the tax base and improving the allocation of expenditure. All these CSS, there's a committee which says they can be reduced to 59 schemes and give much better incentives to states. And for tax, it's just a question of fairness. The super rich are at least paying some tax. And you have with all the growth, there's a large base which is not tapped. And you have the IT systems and you can farm that better and target so that base broaden.
But what are the prospects for disinvestment? Or would you say they should go further and look at strategic sales as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to see one PSU just in this budget. What a powerful signal he would send, that instead of disinvestment, let us do a strategic sale of one loss-making, dirty, ugly PSU.
Never.
And you will send. But you know, more than that, it's a philosophical here. It's a question of attitude. Where are reformers, and Mr. Chidambaram is one of those reformers, where they have failed is in not educating the Indian people about reforms. People have got the idea that the reforms help the rich. And nobody has gone and told people that there's a difference between being pro-business and pro-market. Pro-market means to create competition, which helps to lower prices, which helps to improves quality of products and services. And this leads to a rules-based capitalism. Pro-business means that you keep discretionary power in the hands of bureaucrats and netas, and that then ultimately leads to crony capitalism. Now this is a very simple thing, but I tell you, the members of the Congress party don't understand this.
But then Mr. Bhargav, you've worked in the public sector, you have over the years you've worked in the private sector now. Is that a function of the yoke of socialist dogmas that comes as part of the baggage of the Congress party? Because that's exactly what we've seen over the last 9 years.
In fact, I have a little disagreement with what Gurcharan said, because I think that pro-business does not necessarily mean crony business. It means that looking at the decisions which you have to take regarding a business to reduce the cost of doing that business, to make it more competitive.
But in Vivek, do you think the magic wand that we are searching for 10 years or 9 years later could be infrastructure this time? Or do you think that will be ignored again?
You know, there are no magic wands, but I do not think one should have any expectations from this budget. I mean, Gurcharan, what is this? I mean, I agree with you about disinvestment, but with this government, we are nationalizing everything, including employment generation. And how can you reasonably expect even disinvestment? So I don't think we should have any expectations. We should take it for granted. There will be that populism, there will be that slate of numbers. The maximum that we can hope for is that that expenditure is somewhat controlled because the rating agencies want it.
Ajit,
No,
should we have no expectations at all?
No, I think let's focus on at least 2 or 3 tangible things which are budget related. Of course, implementation, reforms are beyond. To take Mr. Bhargav's point, the income tax demands, the litigations. You know that the very big number, 4 lakh crores, 400,000 crores is stuck in litigation between the income tax people and the counterparty. More than half the time, the counterparty is actually a public sector or a government organization. So surely, some enabling provision can be passed which says deemed resolution if the amount is less than a particular threshold or older than 3 or 4 years, some time limit.
But that we are saying, Ajit, in the Vodafone case, there's
No,
forward
that is
movement,
not a small number. I'm saying
backward movement, forward movement, and then backward movement.
any
again.
dispute which is less than 50,000 rupees or whatever, few lakh rupees. That's one example. Second example is increasing tendency in the last few years is the amount of refunds. I believe about 1 lakh crores of refund every year on the income tax account itself. It is showing that demands are being made which are excessive and they are reflecting refunds.
Can I say something on this?
Yeah.
I think this is an important point and we must realize this. This is deliberate.
It's 1 out of 3
because I
lakhs.
want to show that increase in
Correct.
tax revenue, knowing fully well that I may lose later on, but this year I've shown that increase in tax revenue.
But Shauri sir, will we
There's a
see any
systemic thing
intent
here.
whatsoever, or will it just be a placid, tepid? Will we see some intent? Too very late, but
No,
will we see
sir,
intent?
I don't see. I mean, they may make announcements, and they will make announcements which they don't have to implement just now. So that, अरे यार, अगली बार आएंगे तो फिर देखेंगे, नहीं तो दूसरे का problem है. Then we will shout, why are you reducing this particular thing? I would have very minimal expectations. One is, will he stop singing lullabies? And will the industry stop applauding him for that? Oh, we are decoupled. What happened to that decoupling now? Now it is because of Greece that we are down. Second, oh, our fundamentals remain strong. Similarly, if you make it, the whole issue of India today will be filled if you just made a list, one-line list of the number of times that Montek, Pranab Mukherjee and Chidambaram and the Prime Minister have said inflation is coming down 3 months hence. So will he stop singing these lullabies? Second, if there were one suggestion I would make to them, it's too late for everything, but for the next government, ignore the opposition. They don't have much time for details. Other than Yashwant Sinha, there is nobody there who knows or is interested in detail in these matters. What you should do is to make a partner with the chief ministers who are facing the same problems, and then run a new system of economic governance, clearances, executions, and so on. They want in their states also for that.
But Ashima, we've seen some intent on the part of this dispensation over the last 6 months in terms of fuel pricing. There is, I thought the 50 paisa calibrated hike every month was actually smart strategy, because finally somebody bit the bullet. So do you think there is some level of intent there?
Yes, I think so, because the government is now thinking of re-election, and for a long time they were thinking of survival, and now they have to face elections. So, and given the glare of rating agencies, they cannot really follow the populist method.
Everything seems to be predicated towards what Standard & Poor's, Moody's and Fitch want you to do. Everything seems to be moving in that direction, and that seems to be a travesty.
No, but thank God.
We can't afford to become a junk country.
Yeah.
Because the amount of foreign
Why have we
exchange
got to,
outflow will
but why have we got there?
No,
See, the
that's
FRB
a different
helps
matter. But
states
some of these
improve.
decisions which have been taken, including what Ashima, these fuel decisions, are based on this factor, which is a good thing. I think this is a good thing which we are doing. I was just going to add one other point. We were talking of tax. Has government ever analyzed that all the cases which go from one court to another, how many does government win and how many do they lose?
I think we could go on discussing this for a long time. Clearly things are not in a good state and there are many possible solutions. Not everyone is optimistic about them. Our last segment is a rapid fire round in which we'll ask all our panelists one by one to give their prediction for the rate of growth and rate of inflation at around this time next year, just before UP is going in for an election.
And I think we should also ask all our panelists for one big ticket thing that they would want to see in the budget.
So if we'll start with Ashima, your figure for growth, your figure for inflation, and one big thing. And Mr. Shohri, hopefully everyone will make reasonable predictions, not like a few of you, Mr. Chidambaram.
I say 6% for growth and 5.5 for WPI inflation. Big ticket would be to follow reform in the sense of simplifying, say excise tax in line with GST. Give a signal that this is, because that is very, very important for reducing transaction costs.
Vivek?
I will be wonderfully precise. Planning Commission's 5.37%.
For growth and inflation?
Growth. Inflation, I would say GDP deflated inflation 7%.
The one big ticket measure that they could do?
I'm listing it, but there are all kinds of nuances behind this. Please tax only income. Do not tax stuff that is not income. And I'm saying this because of a history that's associated with Mr. Chidambaram.
Sure.
So I would not know about the numbers, because I believe that much of this is what Professor Galbraith used to call that the function of Indian planning at a ministry is therapeutic targetry. High targets, because that is sort of therapy for us. So I would not know the numbers, but if there were one ticket thing that I would like, it is really the focus, not in the budget, but in general, on improved governance. Sandeep said, oh, is it the case that good economics makes good politics or does it make good politics? Actually, good economics is a part of good governance, and good governance makes for good politics, as Narendra Modi and others have shown whenever they got the chance.
Mr. Bhargav?
My figure of growth would be between 5 and 5.5. I don't think it's going to go beyond that. Inflation, I agree with Vivek, around 7%. And I agree with Mr. Shohri that what we really need is governance. Much, much better governance in all the areas which we are doing. How that comes in the budget, I'm not sure, but we need governance.
Mr. Das?
In an optimistic scenario, what would you suggest growth would be
Well, I would say
a year from now?
between 5 and 6, and inflation 7 below, 6.5 to 7. And the one big thing that I would like to see, I would like this finance minister to rein in his tax department, and he would come out and say that good governance begins with my department, and I will create a predictable, transparent, fair and equitable method of collecting tax, so that you all will feel that India is also like the rest of the world.
Tell us, Ajit, optimist, pessimist?
I think I'll be a little bit of an outlier in this group. My growth sort of projection is something like 6 to 6.5. I would say 6.5%, not 6%. Although we are still going to have somewhat inflationary conditions, so therefore inflation will continue to be 6.5%. And on the big item, one can talk about a lot of budget-specific items, but I'd like to pick up on what Mr. Bhargav referred to. Just like we have the Project Tiger, which we focus on the health of the tiger, which is a symbol or for the whole pyramid of the system, the biodiversity system. Similarly, if we can just focus as a government to improve our ranking from 132 to, let's say, at least 100 in the ease of doing business in India, that brings it, brings clearance issues, that brings in tax issues, the unpredictability issues. So if the government or the finance minister can announce that we want to bring down this number from 132 to 100 in the next 3 years, let's say, that would be a good big announcement to make.
Well, there you have it from our 6 experts. Some are more optimistic, some more pessimistic. The fact is that the UPA will probably be kicking itself that it let a 9% growth story degenerate into one that at best would be 6.5%. Let's see what magic Mr. Chidambaram can conjure up on February 28th. The country will be waiting and watching. Thank you.